I used to be wound pretty tight, and it's not a good way to live. Now, I've learned to relax through change of attitude, meditation, and especially Tai Chi. For over 30 years now, I've been working at helping people learn how to relax. I'm a speaker and a trainer, and my tagline is, I'm here to help. What I've discovered is that many people come to my classes or training because something hurts, something's broken. And they say they love the teaching, they like the class, they rate it high, and then they leave. Why? Why is that? It's been a huge question in my life for many years, and not just me. I've heard the same thing from doctors and therapists and counselors. People come because they need change, and then they leave when they begin to change. Why, when we can change with intention? We can choose to change. Why do we fight it so much? I found the answer a few years ago, and I'm sorry to say that, like most truths, it's disappointingly simple. People are afraid of change. Frequently, we'd rather stay in an unpleasant or painful reality than move forward into an unknown and likely uncomfortable change that would lead to a more healthy and peaceful life. We resist change because we are afraid of the unknown. It comes down to fear. Ralph Waldo Emerson, one of my favorites, said, "Our chief want in life is for someone to inspire us to be what we know we could be." Someone to inspire us to be what we know we could be. Another version I've heard quoted more often, a misquote of Emerson, says, "Our chief want in life is for someone to make us do the things we know we should." That's probably more realistic. But here's a reality check. Unless you live in prison, nobody's going to make you do anything. It's up to you. You got to do it yourself. And once again, the answer is simple, but not easy. During COVID, I wrote a book. It's titled Next Steps, Tools for Transforming from Coping to Thriving. Yes, you can buy it on Amazon. It started out being all about change, and it really is, but I kind of went beyond that with the title. It's why we resist change and what we can do to change, how we can facilitate that. Several years ago, I realized that unless and until we understand how our brain works, and sometimes works against us, we're not going to make a lot of progress. And I think it's just easier to explain this. So part two of the book, part two is who I am and why I'm writing this. Part two of the book, extremely important, is called Your Thinker and Operator's Manual. How does that thing work? And I oversimplify it. I don't know if it's oversimplified, but it's pretty basic because obviously there's a lot more to the brain than what I'm going to talk about, but I break it down into two parts. The brain stem, which handles all the bodily functions. It's called the reptilian brain. I sometimes call it the base brain or fear-based brain. Everything you take in through your senses goes through this base brain. And its job is to keep you alive, keep your body alive. And it thinks it runs everything. It doesn't know anything about a higher brain. It doesn't have to. It does its job. It perceives everything as either safe or unsafe. It is one of those two things. There's no gray areas, only black and white. And really, you need do nothing more. Just let your safety brain run the show. And a lot of people just do that. It's the easiest way to go. It's easier to do nothing than something. And advertisers, a lot of politicians, a lot of preachers, online news sources, cable news outlets know that if they can make you afraid and or angry, they can get your money, your vote, and your devotion. They count on people who let their fear-based brain run the show. But there is so much more to life than bodily functions and not dying. To be fully alive, we move from coping to thriving, and we can and should engage our higher brain to get there. This is the part of our brain that thinks. Abstract thought, imagination, creativity happen here. Here's where we can perceive and manage risk. This is where we question and ultimately grow. Life is risky, and we need to know when it's safe to cross the street. There's a story about a man who heard that most accidents take place in the home, so he left home. It's a perfect example of the base brain and how it works. All fear and no sense. The base brain wants to keep us safe. That's all it wants to do. And once we understand that it's how that role can limit us, we can actively and intentionally engage our higher brain to become fully alive. But rather than just tell our fear-based brain, okay, shut up and be quiet, I got this, we need to reassure it, thank it. Yes, you're doing your job, but we're going to work together now, base brain and higher brain. It won't be happy because its first thought is of like a driverless car. And I don't mean an autonomous car with the computers and the sensors, a driverless car. It's going to crash within a minute. That's all it sees. It's just going to crash and it's going to be a disaster. But in time, it will learn to relax because it doesn't have to run the show. It doesn't have to be hyper vigilant. It's part of a team. We're going to be okay. But that fear-based brain has accumulated a huge file of things to be afraid of. And some of them are legit. Most are just fears. And a lot of unknown stuff that just sounds scary. It's down in the basement somewhere and it's got to be bad, right? Most of the time we don't acknowledge those fears. And we just feel afraid of something, just kind of an underlying dread that things could go wrong. Well, let's get in there. Let's open up that file and see what's in there. In my book, I say I advocate, but no, I insist that the reader open up those files. Some of them have been down there a long time, and we don't know what they are. They open them up and list them. And I don't mean type them, I mean ink on paper. Because there is something almost magical about taking something from here, running it down here, getting a pen and writing on paper. It makes it real. And that's how we make some real progress. There's lots of ways you can do this. I'm an advocate of just do it as fast as you can and get it over with. And that's what you do. You get a legal pad and write it down, all those things. Now, facing our fears can seem pretty daunting, to say the least, but frequently I've found that what we fear isn't nearly as bad as we thought it would be. And frequently what we fear is our emotions. We're afraid that we're going to feel bad if we fail at something. We're afraid we're going to feel bad if people don't like us. We're going to feel bad if we don't understand something. We're going to feel bad when we're uncomfortable because it's a hard time being who we could be, to be your true self. What if the person who you really are is somebody you don't like? I mean, that's a fear. I don't think it's ever happened because we're all wonderful. Our fears hold us back. What's the worst that can happen? Everything. That's what our base brain says. It screams, avoid it at all costs. It looks to the future, and we can't know the future. So it's a black hole. So our base brain fills in that empty future with everything horrible it can think of, which is everything. What a rotten way to live. We must engage our higher brain and inject some logic and sense in this in order for us to live completely and thoroughly and to truly be who we are meant to be. Aristotle, by the way, I'm looking for a single name for myself because you have more credibility when you have a single name. You know, Rumi, Jesus, Aristotle. I haven't come up with it. Dan just doesn't work, you know. Aristotle, he said this: one must care for the truth rather than what people think. That's a tall order. One must care for the truth rather than what people think. Now, let me be clear. This does not give you permission to be a grumpy old goat, a gog, we call them. The base brain is all fear and emotion, whereas the higher brain engages in logic. And I've found that frequently in a tussle between emotion and logic, almost always the emotion wins. Now, I understand you can't talk someone or yourself out of fear with logic. You can't just say, well, that's not logical. Here's the logical answer, and they go, oh, okay. That doesn't work that way. But we have to engage our higher brain, acknowledge our doubts and fears, and at least start the process. And it becomes easier and smoother over time. It's a thing you practice. And your base brain learns to relax, and it becomes much easier. I think it's interesting how just the right words at just the right time in just the right order can be so powerful. Words are amazing things, and all that we're doing is sharing thoughts. But when they're done just right, it's terrific. Now, I've been trying to make this point for a long time that's coming up here, but it was convoluted and wordy, and it made sense to me. But recently I ran across this, and we don't know who said it. I like to research quotes and find who really said that so we can attribute the quote. But we haven't done that here. And it's such a powerful, powerful truth. Once you become fearless, life becomes limitless. Once you become fearless, life becomes limitless. And it is so true, and it's such a wonderful place to be. So again, we come back to our fears. What are we afraid of? Being wrong, being judged, a broken heart, feeling foolish, making mistakes. We're afraid to say what we think. We're afraid to ask for what we need because we're afraid of what the response would be. But once you learn to say what needs to be said with love and not fear and anger, then we can truly communicate and live a full life, moving from coping to thriving. I've even developed a little workshop on saying what needs to be said and how to communicate as an adult. We're afraid of breaking the rules. Well, whose rules are they? Who said? Our higher brain has the ability to discern, comprehend, and then decide which rules are real and those imposed upon us by long dead ancestors. Somebody said tradition is manipulation by dead people. There's some truth to that. Once we know that, we can then decide which rules to bend and which rules to break. If you break some rules, you're going to end up with a long time to contemplate the consequences in a small concrete classroom. On the other hand, if you break the rules of literature, filmmaking, art, you can change the world. Now think of the 10 Commandments. Have you broken any? That's a rhetorical question. Do you really understand them? Good question. What are the consequences? A condemnation, forgiveness? I don't know. What if God wasn't who or what you thought God was? How'd you feel about that? What if there is no God? What if there's no heaven? Should you fear death? Good questions. What if you have doubts about your faith? All good questions. Big questions. And I don't know that we can truly answer these, but even if you were certain, you could still be wrong. Is that something to fear? I think that if we acknowledge that fear, that as earnest as we are, we could be wrong, which is really understanding that we are fallible humans. And we can see that a loving God would understand our doubts. It's how we grow. But if you don't recognize the fear, it festers and it spreads like a weed in our soul. Expose it to the sunlight. One of my favorite quotes is, "Tell the truth and run." And frequently people don't want to hear the truth, do they? Sometimes they get very defensive and very angry. They'd rather live in their own little fantasy world than in reality. And as uncomfortable as it is, I am committed to understanding the truth and living in reality. Carl Sagan said, "If it can be destroyed by the truth, it should be. If it can be destroyed by the truth, it should be." Jesus told the truth and paid the price. Now, some may say, "See what happened to him? I'm not going to tell the truth. I'm not going to do that." I would say that Jesus was fearless because he wasn't afraid of the judgment, the condemnation of others, or even death. He understood that what we call death is a transition from one level of life to another. There's nothing to be afraid of. That's my take on it. And I note that with over 2 billion Christians in this world, the concepts of justice, love, forgiveness, charity, peace, and compassion are still radical ideas. So many of us are afraid of the truth. Some say faith and fear are incompatible. I understand the thinking, but I disagree. I see them as two sides of the same coin. We have fear and we acknowledge that, but we move forward with faith anyway. Our fear-based lower brain says, "What's the worst that can happen? Everything." Whereas your higher brain says, "I have faith that everything will be okay in the end, even though I can't see the outcome. Sure, I may be uncomfortable, there may be some great change, but I have faith. I'll be just fine." In the Bible, it says, "Fear not," or "Do not be afraid," 365 times. Do we believe it? Many people are afraid to ask the bigger questions because once you ask one question, you question one thing, then you must question everything. And there's a scary place to be. I like this church because we are not afraid. Our church invited the atheists to speak at our adult forum. How many churches would do that? It went so well, we invited him again. We are not afraid. 20 years ago, we voted to become an open and affirming congregation. It was a courageous act, and I, like others, was a little hesitant because I was pretty certain we would lose at least our stained glass windows and quite likely possibly our church could be burned to the ground. There's that much hate and fear out there. Those are legitimate fears, but we moved ahead. We moved ahead anyway. Good for us. We're not afraid. We were courageous in spirit. We were courageous in spite of legitimate fears, and we did the right thing. Do not be afraid 365 times. Our church is not afraid. We don't have all the answers, but we welcome all the questions without fear. We are fearless.